Building an app is like an enormous amount of effort. And I find it's literally hundreds of times easier if it's something you care about. And even if nobody else uses it, you'll be able to use it and enjoy it. So I always try to tell people, like, build something that you yourself will enjoy and you know a lot more about it in that way, so you can approach it from a more unique perspective.
Hello, and welcome to the Builders Gonna Build podcast, where founders, engineers, product managers, even professors tell their stories about building awesome products and share tips for how to build a successful business. I'm your host, Ilya Bezdilev. I'm a CEO and co-founder of Metacast, a new podcast app that we are about to ship in a couple of months. And with me is my co-host, fellow co-founder and CTO of Metacast, Arnab Deka. Arnab, why don't you take it away?
Today, we have with us Christian Selig. Christian is the creator of the much-loved Apollo app. It's one of the most well-known iOS apps for Reddit. We'll talk about all that journey. Christian, your tenacity working on the app for so long, the whole journey, it's kind of inspiring for me personally. So welcome to the podcast.
That's very nice of you to say. Thank you. It's a real honor. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So before, I guess, we get into all of that, Apollo and the kerfuffle with Reddit and everything else, why don't you introduce yourself to us?
I am an iOS developer from Eastern Canada. I've been doing this, probably about 10 years now, more or less professionally. And I kind of just try to build apps that I would enjoy and hopefully other people would enjoy normally, kind of to scratch my own itch. I've had a lot of fun doing that over the years and hope to keep being able to do it as far into the future.
Right. The most well-known one is Apollo, but you did do PixelPals, and I think there was one more before, right? Syllabus or Syllables or...
Yeah, Syllable. Yeah, I had that. Yeah, probably a few years before Apollo was my first app I had released during university. Yeah, it's a good time.
So were you always right from school, you were always into I want to build apps? Or specifically iOS apps?
Kind of, yeah. I think when I was finishing high school, it was kind of that, I don't know if you're super familiar, but there was that period where Apple had all those commercials for there's an app for everything, or there's an app for that. Apps were this cool new thing that people didn't know about. And the idea to me as a teenager that you could build something on your computer and then publish it, and some guy walking down the street could be using something you built, that didn't seem like a thing before that. I'm sure it was, but it just kind of was like, holy crap, that's really cool. And I really liked Apple stuff. So it seemed like something I was like, okay, I'm trying to figure out what to do after high school. That feels like a good thread to tug on. So I ended up going down that route, and it was a pretty good decision, I think, all things considered.
Yeah, I want to take a bit of a detour here. You mentioned that you were a teenager when Apple came out with apps and all that. So when we were graduating universities at age 22 or something, iPhone didn't even exist at that point. The smartphones were the Nokia phones with buttons and Blackberries. So I was always curious, because I guess I don't get to meet many people who are kind of much younger than me. How old were you when you first experienced a computer or a phone or something, any kind of technological gadget, if you even remember?
I want to say it was later than a lot of schoolmates I would have had. It was around 11 or so. I think my family finally got a Windows XP computer. Yeah, and that was kind of my first exposure. It wasn't anything really groundbreaking to me. I think the first tech I fell in love with was when I got an iPod. The computer would have been around 10. I was a late bloomer. You always hear the kids who were started programming at 3 years old, and I wasn't quite there, but yeah, it was a lot of fun.
So how did you work your way into Apple? You were an intern there. You also worked there for a little bit, or?
Yeah. It was during university, our university had a co-op program. So they're go find a job. I was already doing they wanted you to do 3 internships, and I was doing my second in Toronto at a company. And I was actually about to go back to school, but I saw that they had a job posting for an internship at Apple. And I was like, I'll just send a PDF in and apply and see if they say anything, not intending to hear anything back. And I had plane tickets booked to go back home. And I think a week later, a recruiter emailed back, and we did a bunch of interviews, and I ended up going to California that summer, which was a really fun, unexpected departure for me. And that was my last jobby job that I had a regular paycheck coming in through. And yeah, that was almost 10 years ago now.
What were you working on there in your internship?
The team doesn't exist anymore as far as I know, but it was kind of this enterprise app development side of things. It was almost like evangelism, where they did a lot with working with companies on how to build apps well. Back then was a lot of the time when a lot of companies were building web apps instead of normal apps, and they were being okay, here's why a native app is a better experience, and we can show you some best practices. And it was a lot of fun in that way. There was so many smart people there you got to work with and learn a lot from. And it was, funnily enough, the summer that Swift came out. So it was a cool place to be in terms of everyone at Apple, a lot of them learning about it for the first time and kind of trying to figure it out.
And it was 2014, you said?
Yeah, yeah.
And you had already started working on Apollo before this, right? Or
Yeah, I think I had the general idea in the back of my head. I don't know if I had any code at the point. Apollo is like 100% Swift. So if I had any code before it, I ended up throwing it out. But I think it was just kind of like design ideas at the time. Because an Apple's really touchy about like when you're working there, you can't work on any apps of your own. I think I like officially started getting serious about it the September or whatever it was after I finished at Apple.
what drove you to like focus on a Reddit client, Reddit app?
Well, with my first app, Syllable, like it was a similar thing where it was to help you learn to read faster. And it was kind of just something I wanted to learn how to do. And I was kind of thinking about, oh, what do I want to do after this? And I really loved Reddit and I was using it all the time. It was like super big during university. And at that point, there wasn't really any apps out for iOS that were kind of what I wanted in a Reddit app, similar to what you folks are doing with like the podcast space. And I was like, I use this so often. So I want it to be exactly what I want if I'm using it this often. It's like having like a, I don't know, like being a carpenter and having a hammer. If you're using it that often, you want it to be really good and really comfortable in your hand. So I was like, screw it. And like at that point, to be clear, like Alien Blue and a few others were out and they were like phenomenal apps, but they just didn't like perfectly jive with me. Like I wanted something that felt really like Apple-y. Maybe it was since I just finished the internship there, but I wanted something that was like super iOS design. I got started on that and it ended up being a lot of fun. Like I learned so much doing it because I was still pretty green as an iOS developer. But yeah, just building something for myself there and finding what worked and what I liked. It was a really fast and fun journey getting to something that I could actually use. And yeah, it was a lot of fun.
Where did the name come from?
So I was walking around campus with a friend of mine and I was like, I could not come up with a name for it. And we were trying to think of like how you could come up with a name. We were going along the line of thinking like, okay, Reddit with its mascot and whatnot, it's like kind of an alien. So there's kind of like a space theme going on. And this Reddit app helps you explore Reddit, which is kind of space themed. So what helps you explore space? And you're like, okay, kind of like a spaceship. And we're like, okay. And then it was like Apollo is one of the most famous spaceships or space shuttles, I guess. And I was like, that's a great name. It's alphabetically high. It has like a nice punch to the name. As soon as I said it out loud, I was like, that's the name. That's perfect. I really like that.
I guess I'm just realizing that it also sounds very close to Apple itself.
It does. Yeah. No, honest to goodness, I'm not even sure I ever put that together. But yeah, there's kind of a nice mix there. And it kind of has app in the name too. So there's a bunch of little Easter eggs there almost. And it turns out I didn't realize until like years later that the day that the Apollo space shuttle landed on the moon or whatever is my birthday. I wasn't born in 1969, but it was like the same day of the year. So a lot of people were like, oh, you named it that because you have the same birthday. And I was like, no, it just happened to work out like that. Yeah, it's a good name.
So tell us a bit about your mindset at this point. You're like fresh out of an internship. What gave you the conviction that this is what you want to do? And was it more of a hobby project at that time? Or was it like a full-time, this is what I'm going to put all my time into for the next however many years it takes?
At the beginning, I think it was effectively just like a hobby project. I built Syllable and it gave some like nice, like a few $100 a month here, and which in university is like, you're a millionaire. So that was handy. And I was satisfied with that and where it was. So I was looking for something new to cut my teeth on. And I knew it would be a big project, but I knew I liked it a lot. So I could probably just see it through just for my own use. So it became something that I just wanted to do as like a fun thing to do. And in worst case scenario, it would be a good item for the resume or something. But mostly it was just, I love building apps and it was something fun to build. And then eventually got to the point where I'm like, hey, this is usable. Like maybe some other people would care about this. And I ended up posting about it. And thankfully people did. And at that point, it kind of became like, maybe this can evolve further than just a hobby project. And it can become something that I can turn into something of a career. Because when I finished Apple and started doing it, I think I still had 2 semesters left or maybe even 3 of university. So I had quite a bit of time before I had to go out into the real world where I could build Apollo. So I was still just finishing it there during university. And I think by the time I graduated, it was at a good point. And I was like, okay, I can either go get a job or I can like see this thing through that a lot of people seem to actually like, and maybe it'll be worthwhile. And yeah, thankfully I ended up going with it.
Great, yeah. How long did it take for that initial, like from a hobby phase to like, okay, maybe I want to throw this out into the world and maybe people will like it?
That's a great question. I want to say it was about 1.5 years of building it somewhat seriously. Maybe closer to 1 year. I can't quite remember, but it was somewhere around 1 year where I was happy enough that I can at least show this to people. It's very alpha. It's not a beta, it's the very alpha level, but it's comfortable enough that I can post it.
So tell us a bit about like what was in there. There were no notifications back then from what I remember. You could browse Reddit, I guess. Could you like comment? Were pretty much all what you would expect from a client already in there?
For the initial beta, it was pretty bare down. You could comment and browse subreddits, and you could definitely sign in and everything, but I remember like the initial alpha was like very, very alpha. There was a lot of bugs and a lot of things I needed to fix. And I think it took me like from when the beta was posted, another year and a half of work to get it from this unpolished potential to something that I could actually submit. And by the time it was actually available for purchase on the App Store, if anything, I think I went too far and I kept adding more and more features because I was like, it needs this in order to be a compelling app at launch. There's already Reddit apps, and if it doesn't do feature X, nobody's going to take it seriously.
We are familiar with this side of it.
And in all honesty, I probably could have released it earlier and it would have been fine. But yeah, I just kept tacking on features. And I remember my girlfriend was just like, stop. I can tell you're adding a feature. Stop it. There's bugs. Work on those. I eventually got out the door. But like because of that indecision, I guess, the end result, it actually had quite a few features for the initial. Like there was tons more by the end. But the initial launch was pretty feature packed, I think.
You mean the initial public launch? Walk us through when you had your alpha, when you had your beta, the public launch. Were you using some kind of private groups for testing? Actually, I don't even know if it was available back then, like TestFlight and all.
Yeah, TestFlight was available, but it would have been pretty young.
It was still independent from Apple.
No, I think at this point it was part of Apple, but it would have been like, it was relatively recent. Like, I don't think I was smart enough to figure out all this stuff. Before that, it was really tricky to coordinate all the beta tester stuff. But I want to say it was like January of maybe 2015 that I think this is something that I can talk about. It's shaped enough that it's something I can talk about. And I posted it on Reddit on one of like the promotional days. And I'm like, hey, I'm working on a Reddit client. It's more of a focus on an iOS first design. Is anybody interested in beta testing it? Here's some screenshots and videos and whatnot. And it ended up like that post went pretty viral as far as like Reddit Apple-y posts went. And I had more beta testers than I could ever use fully. And I ended up adding them. And then I think it took, a year and a half after that, I finally ended up releasing it. But through that period, I just had all those beta testers who were like, come on, release it. And all these people who hadn't gotten to the beta, who had heard about it from the beta testers talking about it, who wanted me to release it. So there was a decent amount of pent up demand by the time I did actually get around to posting it, which helped with the launch, which also went really well, thankfully.
Can you share, if you remember, how many people were there? Was it like in the hundreds or in the thousands?
For the beta testing, that's a great question. This was the period where I think Apple had caps. They do still, but it was much lower then, where I think like when I first launched, it was like you can have 1,000 beta testers and that maxed out. And I think by the end, it was like 5,000 maybe. And I think it pretty much had that more or less fill.
At this point, there was no like pricing or anything, right? From what I remember.
Yeah. It was just at that point, by the time the app was released, like I hadn't made $1 off of it. You can't make money through betas, obviously. That's how TestFlight works. But yeah, there was no like pre-order pricing or anything. And I'm not even sure. I think I always knew in the back of my head, I was like, I'll have a pro version that unlocks some extra features because that was just how things worked on the App Store back then. But yeah. So I was hoping for the launch.
So I'm curious, for your very first priced version, how did you think about pricing? What kind of tiers were available? And how did you think about setting the price point?
I didn't put a lot of thought into it because I was still like basically a kid just trying to release an app. I hadn't thought about it as much as I maybe should. And I think I kind of just looked around at what other apps in the space were doing. And in hindsight, like it was comically cheap. Like I think it was like $1.99 for Pro, like when I first launched it. And I think that's just like what Alien Blue, because I think by the time I launched it too, the Reddit app, or Reddit had bought Alien Blue and then turned Alien Blue into the official app. So there was already like a popular free app because Alien Blue had been made free as well. So like there was kind of like, I can't charge $20 for this because people are going to be like, well, I'm happy with what I already have. I wanted a price that was a low enough barrier of entry that you could kind of just impulse buy it and not be too bothered, while also keeping it so like if you didn't want to buy it at all, you'd still be good. So that was kind of where I approached it from. In hindsight, I think by the time Apollo was closed, it was like $5 for the Pro version, just because it was one of those things where like you got so much for the price. It was kind of silly pricing it as little as I did. And as I increased it over the years, I don't know if I got a single person who was like, this is unreasonable. So not the most educated in initial pricing, but it worked out okay.
And it was a one-off payment, no subscription.
Yeah, exactly. There was no subscriptions. And I think the first subscription I added like a year later because I started having some like ongoing fees with one of the features I wanted to introduce. But at the initial, it was free. You could pay like $1.99. And I think David Smith had a similar thing in his Pedometer Plus app that I thought was really cool, where it was like you can pay $1.99, you can pay like $5 or pay 10, like basically pay what you want to unlock it. And I thought that was super cool. In hindsight, I think like 95% of people just chose whatever the cheapest option was. In my head, I was like, oh, people are going to be really generous. But ultimately, people just want the cheapest option available. So it didn't work out quite like that, but it was kind of like, yeah, that tip-based system.
Yeah, you had a tip jar and everything very early on itself. Yeah, I remember.
Can I ask a question about the tip jar? Because we were considering something like that as well. The plans that we want to introduce in our app, will be like the free plan with ads, and then kind of an ad-free, then almost like a pro version kind of thing. But then we also want to add like a supporter version, which is double the price of the pro, basically no extra features. So it's like, if you want to give us more money, you're welcome to. So how did it work for you? Do you remember what percentage of people paid you more than the minimum?
Honestly, my memory is that it was very low. I want to say like 90+% of people just chose whatever the cheapest option was. And it was to the extent that like, I think by the end for the pro version, I think I just had the one button, just because in my head, I was thinking like, if 90+% of people are choosing just the one option, having like the 3 or 5 options or whatever I did is just going to confuse that 90% who already know what they're like. Maybe I can get the total amount of people buying it higher by just making the page less confusing. Sure, I'll lose like an extra dollar tip here and there, but maybe the entire tide will increase kind of thing. So it wasn't that big for me. I also had a separate tip jar that was kind of just like, oh, you bought pro, maybe you just really like the app and you're like, dang, I'm feeling generous today. You can throw an extra $2 in or whatever. It got used here and there, but it was like, compared to the price of unlocking the actual app, it was like maybe 1% of all app revenue. So that was kind of like, you could take it or leave it. The only time I found it did make a big difference was near the end. I forgot who I saw did it, but I'd have a changelog that would be like, hey, I added like feature XYZ to this version of the app. And people loved that. They'd be like, oh, great. I can see that. Oh, there's all these new features that I care about. Whereas if there wasn't like kind of an alert, I probably would just not know that feature's there. And then eventually I was like, oh, and I'll just add at the bottom like a button like, hey, if you like these extra features, throw in $2. And that ended up being used like 100 times more than like the separate tip jar, almost like a contextual tip jar. That made a difference. But I find one on the App Store page and the one that was kind of just like separate and you had to find it yourself just out of goodwill, that I don't think was super worthwhile. It's an interesting question though, because I know with Ivory, for instance, the Mastodon client, Paul has it so you can, I think like there's effectively those two versions where you can pay like $10 a year or you can pay 20 and just out of the goodness of your heart. And I know like myself and a lot of people pay extra just because you know these developers, they're nice people. Yeah, you care about, and like maybe that's the way to go. I feel like it would almost be different with subscriptions where like it just feels like easier barrier to entry where like I was much more willing to do that, especially if you know the developers and you kind of know their story. It's definitely something worth playing around with. You could always A/B test it and just say like, I'll put it up for 50% of people and like, did it even move the needle? Because it might not, and it might just make the page more confusing, but I'd say it's worth testing.
Quick detour while we're on the topic of like tips and revenue from tips and all that. You had some really cool t-shirts and stuff too. I have one upstairs. I should have been wearing it today, but I forgot.
No, it's all good. I forgot too, yeah.
Anyway, so did you design all that? How did that come about? Did you make any substantial revenue of it?
The whole merch business is another area where I'm just clearly not a very good businessman because I feel like there's a lot of complexity and a lot of potential revenue there that I just didn't understand too well. So for me, I just went with Cotton Bureau, and they're fantastic folks. They were super helpful, and they do really high quality stuff. And they helped out a lot with getting everything set up. And I was basically just like, I know Apollo has all these app icons that are really well designed from these really talented designers that like I paid quite a bit of money to get designed. And I was like, instead of just living in the app, it would be cool if they had a physical version as well. And t-shirts kind of felt like, at least for me, I was like, I want to see this design on a t-shirt, and maybe some other people will too. And I published them there, and quite a few people bought them. Like, it wasn't substantially like, you see like YouTubers are like, oh, 50% of my revenue is merchandise. I would be highly surprised if any app developer had even double-digit revenue, but it definitely helped. And it was kind of just always cool seeing someone like yourself saying like, oh, I have one of those shirts. Like, that's cool. You can't put a price on that. For me, it wasn't a massive mover. With Cotton Bureau, they're focused so on quality and they take a slightly larger cut than other people. It depends too that if you got a partner, like I only think I made a few dollars per shirt selling them, but there's other partners that if you maybe put in a little bit more work, you could maybe make like $10 a shirt. And then at that point, it might be more worthwhile. But these were kind of like premium shirts at a premium price. So it was kind of like a tricky sell for a lot of people. When the app started to like wind down, I sold probably 90% of the shirts Apollo ever sold in its lifetime were sold in the last 2 months. And that made like a lot of money. And that was one of those moments where I was like, damn, am I stupid or something? Like this made
the profit margin.
Yeah. And I was like, I've clearly been neglecting this aspect of the business for years now. There's this demand because a lot of people are like, I didn't even know you sold shirts. So I think I was doing maybe something wrong there. Yeah, it's a tricky one where I think if you are willing to put in the time and effort and have some cool designs, I think, and have a good partner you can work with where you can get a good revenue share, I think it's definitely an area worth exploring.
Yeah, I'm curious on this point because we've been doing some t-shirts here and there, like nothing major, but I have been playing with a bunch of print-on-demand providers, and actually right now I'm wearing one of the Metacast t-shirts that we did for ourselves. It's about $10. You control how much you sell them for, and then basically their cut is fixed, and then you can control your margin. And I forgot my question.
While you remember that, another detour off this detour, and this is how this podcast goes sometimes, by the way. You mentioned that you got a lot of like really good app icons done by high profile kind of designers, right? How did that come about? Did you reach out to them, or were like people interested because they were already loving the app?
It was very convoluted how I got there. I think for the initial like 1.0 app launch, I had no designers working on app icons. I just remember, I think it was James Thompson for PCalc. This was around like iOS 10.4, I think, when they announced you can change an app's icon. Like for 10 versions of iOS, that was just not a thing. And I remember thinking like, oh, that's so cool how James does that in PCalc. Like, I love that you can customize the icon. And I remember being like, okay, for Apollo, I want that. That would be a cool pro feature. And people loved that just as much as I did. Like, and in hindsight, it's not super surprising. Like you see in Fortnite and stuff, how much people love buying skins and stuff. It's not like super surprising that people love customizing things, but it was to me at the time. And those ended up being a big reason people bought the original pro version. And honestly, it was just like me going into Sketch and changing the blue icon to a red one. It was super low level graphic design, but people really loved it. So about a year after Apollo launched, notifications for when you get a reply to your comment or whatever, or one of the, like the bigger feature requests. And I was like, okay, I'll learn how to build this like push notification server. And I did that, and I like submitted this, and I think I called it like, I don't even remember. It was like Apollo push or Apollo push notifications or something. And I was like, okay, this server costs a fair bit to run because Reddit's API there were some fun aspects about how it was built, but basically there was no way to get a notification when like, say you sign into your Reddit account and like, there's no way for me to know when you got a new message, except if I just asked Reddit repeatedly.
Right. There isn't actually a push mechanism from Reddit's API. It's you poll it and figure out if there's something new.
Exactly. So basically, if I wanted to get timely, and I was competing with the Reddit app, so like I didn't want notifications to come 15 minutes late. I wanted them to come hopefully within 10 seconds or so. So if it was your account, if I wanted it like every 5 seconds, that would be 12 times a minute I'd be checking. And if I did that for like, say I have 1,000 accounts, that would be like every 5 seconds I'd be checking 1,000 accounts. So especially someone new to servers, like this was complex to build and there was a decent amount of server infrastructure involved in it. So I was like, crap, okay, so I can't just shove this in pro. I'll put myself out of business. I'll make it like 99 cents a month or whatever. And if you want that, you can do it. And then funnily enough, I submit that and Apple like immediately rejected it. Not immediately, it took a while, but they rejected it. And I was like, huh. And their reason was that you can't monetize built-in system features. So they were like, push notifications are an iOS level feature and you can't monetize something built into iOS. And I was like, I get that rule at a high level, but I was like, in order for me to provide that feature, I have to pay a bunch. And we ended up getting on a phone call. They were like, we get that, but we can't really remove this rule. So what you should do is don't make it Apollo push, make it Apollo Pro Plus and include push notifications and other stuff. And I was like, okay, I can do that. So I ended up changing it to like Apollo Ultra. And I was like, what other features do I want to add? And I knew icons were like this really big thing that people liked. I was like, I'm not a good enough graphic designer where I can be like, pay 99 cents a month for my artwork. Nobody would pay for that. But I was like, I do know like there's great artists in the community. Let me work with them and I'll make it kind of like, hey, even if you don't like notifications, you can get a new icon every month. And people really, really like that idea. And that kind of just became a thing where I was like, okay, every month, new icon. So like the next 6 years, I want to say, I had an icon designer every month churn out like a new beautiful icon. By the end of it, I think there was like over 100 custom, like really nicely built icons. Back to the t-shirts. Yeah, also happen to make really nice t-shirts as well.
Yeah, okay, coming back to the t-shirts, I remembered my question.
Oh,
Yes.
perfect.
I was curious because you said that the margin was just a few dollars. Did you have to deal with the returns, like if whatever, like the wrong size was shipped, or maybe there was a quality issue?
No, thankfully they handled.
Cotton Bureau.
Yeah. I never handled like a customer issue. I never had any of the t-shirts in my own house that I was shipping out. Like everything was handled by them. You just upload a PNG and basically everything the rest is them. It was really nice about that. I ended up at the end going with Fourth Wall, who's another provider, and you can order samples from them. And you can kind of find like a shirt that you're like, okay, this is a great quality I really like. Here's the cost per shirt. Here's how much I would make per shirt. You can kind of find like a sweet spot between like a shirt that's really good quality, but maybe you won't have to charge the customer $30 to make any money. And that kind of changes the calculus. And like those companies will also handle the customer support and everything. You don't have to go full like Linus Tech Tips and handle all the t-shirt procurement and shipping yourself. I don't think I'd ever want to do that. Most of these companies will handle like all that stuff for you, thankfully.
Yeah, I was thinking more about the case where like if you go to whatever Zara and you buy a t-shirt, you come back home and you're like nah, I don't like it. Or like the size isn't quite right. You just take it back to the store and get your money back, right? Or get a replacement. With an online order, I was always assuming that if somebody doesn't like it, I mean, basically there is no defect with the product, right? If they just want a new one, then it's basically just pure cost.
I think, and I might be wrong, that's a really good point, but I think in Cotton Bureau's case, at least, like they were so awesome about that. I remember a few cases, like somebody would ping me on Twitter and be like, hey, like my shirt, the design came like, it was slightly off center, something like weird, where it's just like 1 in 100. And Cotton Bureau would always swoop in and be like, just email us, we'll handle it. And they would like, just give them their money back completely, or like refund the shipping and everything. Like just keep the off-center shirt. You can buy another one if you want, but just whatever. I don't think that came out of me, the creator's pocket. I think they absorbed that as a whoopsie on their end. Their customer service was really great. So I don't know for sure, but if you just came home from Zara and were like, yeah, I really don't like this after all, they would probably just give you your money back. They had such good customer guarantees that I don't think there was really any worry there.
Right. So let's go back to that. So you launched it. What was the initial reception like? And from what I remember, the Apollo app, like subreddit, that was huge, right, for you in terms of like getting excellent feedback. But you were also very engaged in it. I think I read somewhere that you have over 20,000 comments in that subreddit, like replying to people and all that. So talk us through that process. Like you were the only person working on this by yourself?
So like for the initial launch, like I said, I had thousands of beta testers, and outside of the beta testers, whenever I posted an update in the subreddit, there was like another 1,000 people who weren't beta testers who were like, oh, this looks so good, just post it. I knew there was like a decent amount of pent up demand. I still at that point didn't know if it would be enough that I'm like, okay, I can make a full-time job out of this. At that point, I had graduated university and been working on this for a year and a half, and I was basically just living off of the revenue I made at Apple. So I was living with a bunch of roommates from college, not living like the high life or anything. It was very frugal. So I was like, okay, my goal with this launch is hopefully recuperate enough that I can have a little bit of cash for like maybe the next year. And then worst case scenario, I'll find a proper job after that. When I finally was like, okay, I'm ready to publicly launch this, I made the post in the Apple subreddit, and all that pent up demand came in really clutch, and people were super excited about it, and they upvoted it like crazy. And the initial launch was just 1,000 times more than I could have ever expected. And it did super well. And it was kind of like day one, I was like, okay, this is going to be something I can make into a career, because you always hear people are leaving grumpy reviews like, I have to pay for an app. This is bullshit. It turns out like there's quite a few people who aren't grumpy, who maybe don't talk about it, but are very happy to pay for quality apps. And those people really came through, and it did really well on the first day. And I'm like, okay, I can see this through. I have a million things I want to do better with it. I'm really happy I get to stick with it. And I was smart enough. One of the few smart things I did do was I made it so the first time you log in, it's kind of like, do you want to subscribe to the Apollo app subreddit? So every time you signed into the app, even if you were just testing it, you got almost like an email newsletter where you were like part of the subreddit that you're already using the app in. So it was kind of like hard to escape what was going on in Apollo. You could always unsubscribe, but it was always like front and center, and in an exciting way. So it kind of worked out well for everybody. And that meant that I was building it in this public way for all these people to see. And I had this big subreddit where people could watch the progress on. And it kind of became this like self-momentum entity that I could just keep plugging into over the years to come. Yeah, it was a ton of fun just building on that, especially in the beginning where it was so many people had cool ideas and you were just chatting with them all day and cranking out the updates. And it was a lot of fun.
You never considered getting like a customer support, but I think it's called like customer happiness and whatever else, kind of agents and all that.
I didn't, honestly, because the vast majority of customer inquiries I'd get were through the subreddit. Not a lot of people would post A lot of the people who used the app were obviously people who were familiar with Reddit. And I think they understood that I'll probably be able to get a question or an answer to my question faster if I post it here versus emailing someone and waiting hours or a day for them to answer. So they just post on the subreddit. And 99% of the time, by the time I saw it, somebody else answered the question because it was probably just like an obvious, oh, how do I post? And they'd be like, oh, just go to the subreddit, yada, yada, yada. So like 99.9% of like the customer service was automatically handled by this community that grew up and helped each other and were really helpful toward making the app better and better.
Right. So, I mean, that community is still super engaged and active, I'm sure you know, but yeah.
No, it's a phenomenal spot. I think by the end, it was almost closing in on 1 million subscribers. It was just mind-boggling how many people were there. I think it was ended up being in like the top 500 or 1,000 most popular subreddits. And this is just like a meta subreddit about an app. But yeah, it's bonkers.
It's incredible. I really like your point about offering people to automatically subscribe to the subreddit. The thing that comes to mind is all of those, like you make a purchase of a t-shirt from Zara, so to speak, right? And they like, subscribe to our newsletter. And you're like, of course not. I don't need emails from you, right? But in your case, because it's an app for Reddit, subscribing to the subreddit is just so logical. I'm thinking actually, we want to do our changelog in the form of a podcast. So it's like a metaphor for a podcast app. Maybe you should also have this kind of pre-checked checkbox that like, yeah, subscribe me to your podcast. It's not as annoying as, well, actually, it's probably not even annoying. It's useful compared to all of those email newsletters from retail companies.
That's like a really good point. It's tricky because like, I think it's because like these fashion stores and whatnot have almost ruined the system so much in your expectations over the years that you're not thinking, oh, if I sign up for this, I'm going to get really good deals. It's more so I'm going to get an email every 3 days about a new jacket. In an alternate world where you shopped at Zara and they were like, hey, we notice you shop here a lot. Do you want us to give you a heads up when there's a really good sale? You'd probably be like, hell yeah, that sounds awesome. But unfortunately, that's not what they did. So I feel like with apps, maybe it's hopefully a slightly more better alternate reality where people are able to go, okay, these people haven't completely ruined my perception of how this is going to work. Maybe this will be something I can easily subscribe to and unsubscribe to if I want to. And yeah, thankfully a lot. And it was just so easy to just click no. In so many of the online forums, it's like there's a check mark that's auto-enabled for you and whatnot. I could have done that, but it felt kind of scummy. So I think it's all about setting expectations.
So from the first launch till the demise, we'll come to the demise in 2023 in a little bit. Was the growth and like retention pretty stable, pretty standard, or were there big bursts somewhere? If so, what were those turning points?
I'm the worst at business in some ways. I knew downloads were slowly increasing over time. The revenue was increasing over time. Like you'll see some people are really good at this stuff. They have graphs on their wall and they're tracking everything like super analytically. And I was never super passionate about that. I was like, the app's doing well. It's growing. I'm happy with that. I didn't really follow like the micro trends almost, but at a macro level, there were growth periods whenever I added either a feature people were really clamoring for. I'm trying to think of ones off the top of my head, but like the feature stuff was more so earlier because there was still, when I launched, there was some like obvious stuff I was missing that people were like, I'll come back and check out this app when it has feature X. And so when I added feature X for a lot of people, that would have a noticeable uptick. Near the end, it was just like, Apollo had most of Reddit features pretty well covered. It was less noticeable jumps when new features were added. But a big thing every year was new iOS releases. Just out of fun, a lot of the time, I would just be like, oh, that's a really cool new feature Apple added to iOS. I'm going to add that into Apollo. And be it through being featured by Apple for integrating this new API or just people updating their phone and being like, okay, now what's new? A lot of people came to know Apollo as this app that would have the new shiny stuff. So every September or October or whatever it ended up being, there normally was a nice uptick in users and revenue and whatnot just around the new iOS releases. But outside of that, it was kind of just like a slow, healthy growth curve where people would tell their friends about the app, they would discover the app, they would enjoy the app. It was like 99% word of mouth. And yeah, just continue.
And I think Apollo got a few awards. It was featured by Apple in the App Store quite a few times and all that. How did that come about? Do you apply for these things or?
No, it was so funny. Like Apollo got editor's choice on the App Store, which like blew my mind. But like funnily enough, it was in the US, which is like the best market to get it in. But funnily, I'm Canadian and it wasn't in the Canadian market. I want to say it was Brian who makes the Carrot app. I'm pretty sure he like texted me and told me like, oh my God, like Apollo, because it might have been the same time that Carrot got featured as well as an editor's choice. And I was like, oh my God, to my knowledge, they don't send you an email, you don't apply. Someone tweets at you or something and tells you that you got it. And then you go to your own app store and you can't even see it because it's not on your app store. So you're like, I guess I'll take your word for it. Funnily enough, most of the stuff with Apple is they kind of just surprise you with it. You'll sometimes get like the promotional art requests, which is a different thing, but sometimes they'll just put you on a list or feature you in some way, and it's just news to you.
So some of these were also because like you were one of the early adopters of like Apple would come out with, let's say, for example, Dynamic Island, and yours would be one of the like first apps to integrate in a beautiful way with it. And that's why you'd get featured.
Yeah. Apple, like, they love when they've got a new really cool feature to show off and they've got apps that use it, because it kind of works for both parties. Because if they build a really cool feature and no apps adopt it, there's not much point to the feature, right? You're not just sitting on the home screen swiping around, you're using apps, and those are the core experience. You can build something into your app that customers really enjoy, that Apple's happy that you integrated into your app. A lot of the time, like, some of the features are just really fun to integrate. I remember when Apple added the feature where you can like select the text within the photo, like there's a date or a sign or like it's a story or something. I remember Apple had that in one version of iOS and everyone was like, oh my God, add that to Apollo. And I'm like, I can't, it's not an API yet. Apple's just doing it in photos. And then the next year they added it and it was super easy to add and it was a lot of fun. And you did a few lines of code and suddenly your app had this really cool feature. Little stuff like that. It's fun to integrate. Users love it. Apple loves it. It's kind of just like a win-win-win-win-win. And then you publish that update and like downloads and sales go up and everything. It became a no-brainer to integrate these really cool iOS features because just everybody loved it.
Right. Are there like some specific UX or design philosophies for Apollo that you set up? Like, okay, these things are what's going to make it successful, or this is what I'm aiming for?
In my head, I was kind of just like, I want a Reddit app that was like if Apple themselves designed a Reddit app. So whenever I was adding a new feature, my kind of North Star was I want to build this in a way that feels native to iOS. So there's not some crazy 3D swipe, throw your phone in the air way to do it. It's what you would expect and it's familiar. And it's super easy to be like, I have a really cool way to do this, super innovative. But in my experience, unless it would make it 5 times faster for a user to do it, just doing it in a way that they would immediately know how to use it was much better than like a crazy custom design. And there are a few places where I did have some custom designs, but most of the time I was just building it with, I want this to be like, if you've used iOS at all, I want this to be an app that you can pick up and immediately hit the ground running with. And that was the North Star as I built the app all the way through. I wanted it to be super familiar. That kind of influenced every decision.
I'm curious how much of that was influenced by your time at Apple versus it was part of your worldview before that.
I think it was part of my worldview before that because I kind of had the idea for Apollo being an iOS-y app before I worked at Apple, but definitely going there for that summer reinforced it heavily. I believed in it more and more as I worked in there, and I was like, okay, this is the right idea. This has legs.
And you were also, like you said, in that internship, you were in the right place, right? That team was evangelizing why you should build and how you should build an iOS app. So it's like the perfect place to hone this craft. Yeah.
Yeah, and I had all these awesome coworkers who even after I left, I could text and say like, hey, I'm thinking about this for the feature. And they'd be like, oh, that's great. Maybe try this. And had excellent input. So I had access to some really brilliant, super, super talented people who could give me great input.
Did you consider building an app for Android as well?
It was one of those things where, like, for me, if there was more hours in the day, yeah, that probably could have been fun. But for me, it was like Apollo was taking up so much of my time in a good way. I was enjoying building it. But I just knew like, okay, I'll have to learn Kotlin or Java or whatever it is or was. I'd have to probably spend a few months with an Android phone because I don't really know Android that well. Part of what made iOS great was it felt like an app on the operating system. And if I don't know what an app on the operating system on Android feels like, why bother? There was all these like upfront things I had to get over before I could even start building it. And then at the same time, I just don't have enough time in the day to commit to this. If I had more time, yeah, that sounds like something that could have been fun to do. But iOS was just so great and so fulfilling to build for that it wasn't something that was like I was really down on myself for not being able to do. It was just Apollo for Android 1 was almost like a meme. It would have been cool to have an answer to that. It just really never came to be.
You were spending more time working on the iPad app, right?
Yeah, that was kind of what I was focusing on toward the end. And that felt almost more worthwhile than an Android app to me because it was almost an app for a new platform in that it took much more advantage of the platform. And around like 15% of my users were iPad users. So I said, okay, I can almost expand access to at least 15% of people in a better way where the Android app might just flop. It felt obvious to me at least.
So towards the end, financially, it was doing really well, right? But throughout the process, it was 9 years, right? Did you ever consider taking funding, investments, or did people offer to acquire it, that sort of stuff?
There's lots of offers to acquire it and fund it more and everything, but it was just one of those things where I never saw the benefit, I guess. There's definitely services where that's arguably needed. In order to compete in any meaningful way, you need upfront capital to do what you want to do. If I was building like an AI thing today, having 1,000 GPUs isn't something I could probably just go down to my Best Buy and put on my credit card like that. You need money for that. But for this, for Apollo, like never was I building a feature that I'm like, if I had more money, I could do this, but I'm not able to. I never felt limited by my current situation. The money was always great. The amount I could do was always great. I never felt limited. There was no shortage of ideas that I wanted to build. If anything, like throwing a few more people on the project probably would have been a smart idea at some point, just from a productivity standpoint. But that was another area where I'm like, I've never managed people. Like, I don't know how that would even go. So that was kind of an area I was shied away from a little bit. But there are lots of options to do things differently. But I think the whole bootstrapping and whatnot thing worked out really well, I think.
So before we come to the end, what were some of the like bigger challenges working on Apollo over the years?
Near the end, even before like the demise, the Reddit API was starting to get a little crusty in some ways, where it was clear Reddit had their own internal API they were using for their own apps, and they were no longer keeping that consistent and updated with the public API. So you had features like Reddit chat, which was kind of like a newer version of Reddit private messages, almost in the same way like emails would be to iMessage. The new thing was kind of like shinier, faster messaging. Features like that, they no longer shared in the API. So you would have a lot of users being like, hey, how come I can't use this in Apollo? And you'd have to say like, I'd love to, but I can't. So stuff like that was a little tricky. But outside of that, there wasn't a lot of stuff that was tricky. It was fun to build. It was just like technological challenges, like building the iPad app, since I felt pretty ambitious about it. And since I didn't want like one view controller up at a time, I wanted a multimodal swiping kind of like Twitter for iPads circa 2012 feel. And that took a lot of learning how view controllers work in reference to each other and memory management and keeping everything flowing smoothly and gestural systems. That was definitely the most complex thing I had built. And sometimes I'd take a week to work on something else and I'd come back and it would almost take me a few hours just to like understand the code I had so far, even though it was like heavily commented and stuff. So it was complex. And it's one of the ones that I'm sad I never actually got to ship because so much work was put into it. But at the same time, there was still quite a bit more work left. So at least I didn't have to spend a bunch more time doing that.
It's kind of rare for somebody to work on one app and by themselves, right? You didn't hire anybody for I think the notifications part, you worked with somebody for a little bit, but that was pretty much it.
Yeah, exactly. His name was Andre, and he was phenomenal near the end. It just got to a point where there were too many people for my crappy code that I wrote. He DM'd me on Twitter and said like, hey, I work in this area professionally. Do you want some help? And yeah, that was a good idea.
And I think that part is actually open source, right?
Yeah, Reddit was like saying like, oh, it's so inefficient. They just hit us with requests 24/7. And I was like, no, it's not. Like, we talked to you all about this. We have emails. It's very efficient and written with a lot of attention to detail. And then rather it be our word against them, we just ended up saying like, let's just open source it so people can see that we're not lying.
Okay, so let's talk about the demise of Apollo, right? And it's publicly, like, you've documented it very well. The subreddit Apollo app has a lot of data on it already. So we don't need to like regurgitate everything, but your space. So tell us about your take on it. How does it feel? Not exactly a year, but almost a year back after.
Yeah, it was just so abrupt. I guess my feeling was, like I mentioned, Reddit hadn't been like sharing the API super well over the last few years. So it was like, oh, okay, so they're not super committed to the API. I knew that much at least, but in my head, it was kind of like, we'll just let them do their own thing. We're not going to put a lot of effort into that, but that also means we're not going to necessarily try to destroy it. And I did have interactions with Reddit. If they were going to do something that would potentially break an existing system, like at one point they added requirements for posting. So like if you tried to post and it didn't have a certain flair or a certain keyword in your title, it would fail. So they wanted to make sure everybody who worked with the posting API that worked. So they were honestly great at giving heads up and communicating things that were important. And I always felt like I had a contact there who would answer questions quickly. So they were great from communications and partnership standpoint, but they maybe weren't so great at keeping the API maintained. And that was kind of like my understanding. I was like, okay, this is how it'll be until the end of time. They're just going to do their own thing, make the app as complex as they want with their own features, but they'll leave the core functionality as a thing for advanced users, like people who use Apollo or Narwhal or Reddit is fun or whatever. And then like they were just suddenly like, okay, we're updating the API insofar as like we're looking to monetize it. And we're like, okay, that's honestly fine, because for a lot of us, in the same way that the API hasn't been updated in ages, like I was mentioning, we were like, oh, great. Maybe if we ratify a better relationship where we're like, okay, we're paying you, we're the consumers of this API, maybe we'll get better API access, and they'll put some more effort into it if we're paying potentially thousands or tens of thousands a month.
Quick question at this point. Where do you think this came from? Was it ChatGPT and OpenAI sucking up everything from Reddit and Reddit feeling like, okay, we need to monetize API access to it, or something else?
I think it was a function of that, and that it looked like their financials weren't doing super well. A lot of people I knew who worked at Reddit were saying things like internally the money wasn't as great as, and their projected targets weren't necessarily where they wanted them to be. During the whole saga, I think they ended up laying off a ton of employees. So I don't think financially things were going maybe as well as they wanted. So it seemed to me like they were penny pinching in some areas while also being annoyed at the OpenAIs of the world for consuming all their content for free. And it was one of those things where it's like, I totally get it. Having $1 billion company that's probably worth much more than Reddit is now, taking all their data and almost making an even more valuable company out of it, that must be infuriating. I get wanting to charge that. But to me, it seemed like in the same way that some companies will have licensing for different use cases, they're like, if you're using it for training AI models, here's your pricing, versus if you're building an app for our own users to make the platform better, maybe here's separate pricing. That was kind of how I thought they would do it. Because to be clear, like, all of us had no issue paying. Like I said, if anything, we were like, if we pay, we'll have a better relationship with Reddit, maybe better API access. This sounds great, and it'll give us a healthy future and a more steady foundation with Reddit. And it was kind of one of those things where the devil's in the details, where the pricing that we thought they would announce and that they hinted toward announcing ended up being so much astronomically higher than what they were saying. And coupled with the fact that they gave you 30 days before you'd start incurring charges, it became like 1 month you were happily building the app with a good relationship with Reddit. The next month, they were going to start billing you for potentially millions upon millions a year. It was so abrupt was the main feeling I felt, that I was just like, holy crap. It felt like last month I was working all these hours building this really cool iPad app, but the next month it's like completely over. And that was the most surprising, I think.
And I think this led to the whole big Reddit boycott that lasted a good few days, right? Almost all of Reddit went dark and all that. Yeah, crazy stuff. So at the end of this, I think in June, you decided that this can't go on and you decided to like shut down Apollo.
Yeah, because it was like they were giving us such a short period of time before we'd start incurring charges. With the App Store, there's like certain rules where they're like, if you have a subscription with users and you can no longer provide that subscription, if you pay for a year and halfway through it, I go, I'm not going to give it to you anymore. You have to pay back that other half, which is completely understandable. There was stuff like that where I'm like, okay, I need to figure that stuff out if it comes to that. And so the clock was ticking down. There was only a little bit of time left. At that point, Reddit, they stopped being responsive in emails to being like, can we have a bit more time? They just suddenly stopped answering. So it became a thing where I'm like, I saw no way forward for this to resolve. If they're not communicating with you and you have this massive financial hit coming that you need to deal with and talk to Apple about, they're really forcing your hands there, which ultimately I think was the goal. So it came down to that. I didn't want to close it. Funnily enough, it happened at WWDC where I was staying with a bunch of other developers. And I remember like talking to them and being like, I just don't see a way out of this. And they're kind of like, yeah, this is just kind of a shit sandwich. Yeah, after a lot of talking, it just seemed like the only path forward.
Yeah, and ironically, I think just around this time, Apollo was featured in WWDC.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was sad, but it was also the coolest, almost like goodbye. I think it was the first time Craig ever said Apollo's name, which was super cool to see during a keynote. And they mentioned it in the Vision Pro portion as well. So there's a bunch of really cool stuff. But yeah, it was definitely unfortunate timing.
So at the end of all this, how much of the financials can you share? Like how many active users did you have at the end? Revenue, profits?
Money is a tricky one. I don't want to talk a ton about that. But as far as users go, I think it was around 1.5 million monthly active users were actively using the app. It had a really good amount of people who were either pro, so they had the one-off purchase. I want to say like of the active users, over 50% converted to that. And then there was a good subportion of that who converted to the monthly subscription, which was great in a lot of ways during the period where Apollo was healthy and whatnot. And you had this great underlying subscription revenue and this recurring revenue for features that people cared about that helped keep the app afloat healthily. It kind of cut both ways where when the app shut down, you suddenly had potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars up in the air where you'd have to refund with 30 days notice, basically. And that was where it got scary. And I think it was like the first time in App Store history where that really happened occurred 6 months earlier when all the Twitter apps shut down. So I remember like talking to the poor people at Apple and it's like, you guys have had a year, haven't you? I'm pretty sure like the first time they're going through these processes of like with Tweetbot and Twitterrific and whatnot, and implementing these systems. But of course, the people at Apple were so nice.
So did you end up having to refund people?
Oh, yeah. Thankfully, I didn't have to refund 100% of them because, again, Apple was phenomenal to work with. They had a similar system with Tweetbot and Twitterrific where they said, like, you can put a thing in your app where you can allow users to opt out of the refund. So you can say, like, hey, you have 4 months left on your 1 year subscription. Do you want to get a refund for that, which would be a third of whatever you paid? Or do you just want to say like, hey, thanks for the great app. I enjoyed it. You know what? Don't worry about it. I don't think I can give exact figures because of Apple asking me not to, but there was a good amount of people who said, that's okay. And it helped phenomenally in terms of not having to bear the full brunt of the refund process. But there was still, definitely some hefty costs.
If you barely break even, you might just spend all the money that comes in, and then time comes to do a refund and you actually have no cash, right?
That was the financial outlook, I think, towards the end, right? Because of Reddit.
Yeah. Well, thankfully, I didn't go out and spend all this money on Ferraris and stuff, nor could I have. If I had to refund it, it wouldn't have killed me. Apollo didn't have a ton of operating expenses, but if you had an app where maybe you had crazy server costs every month and you could only pay from month to month, and maybe you did spend that previously, then it could really hurt you. But with Apollo, I tried to save my money, so I could have paid it back, but I'm not even sure that would have worked, because the way it ultimately worked in the end was you're paid each month, right? At one point, you're suddenly getting hit with, say, a $5,000 debit on your account. You basically owe Apple money at that point. If you're going to continue on in the App Store, they're like, whatever, we're going to keep paying you and we can debit that off the amount we're already paying you. But I don't know how it would have worked if Apollo was my only app and say I got X tens of whatever, thousands of dollars in debit fees and I had no other apps to pay for it. I don't know if Apple would have asked for a check or what would have happened, but it would have been definitely a lot messier. Thankfully, I had PixelPals, which is doing very well. So I was able to just pay it off through PixelPals revenue.
Yeah, interesting. I was thinking that in theory, one way to handle this, if you can't pay it back, right? So then this is why legal entities exist, right? Then you basically just declare your legal entity insolvent and bankrupt, whatever the local law is, right? And then basically Apple will have to bear the cost.
That's a great detour, because that's the first conversation I had with you. Now that I remember going back in Twitter DMs, that's what I asked you. How did you go about did you set up a legal entity, C Corp and all that? Yeah.
Yeah. And that probably would have been the answer. Or Apple would have probably had to come after you for damages or something legally. And you probably would have had to declare bankruptcy or something. That would have been a very messy situation that I'm glad I saved money enough not to have to face.
Quick question about the revenue. Did you have globally the same pricing for the app all over?
Funnily enough, the only country I think I had special pricing for was India, because they would always email me and ask about it. And I said, you know what? Fine. You guys are always emailing me. Complete respect. That's awesome. And no, actually, and I think Brazil did too. There was two countries that I was like, you guys are always being it's really expensive here. Can you lower it? And I was like, fine. Yeah. Comparatively, I think Apollo was 90% US users. So India and Brazil combined were probably 1%. So it's you know what? I don't want to take a week's salary for my silly app. If I can lower that a little bit, sure. And I respect the amount of dedication they had to hitting that drum.
I think that 37 Signals with Hey, they have done something similar recently where they reduced the pricing for Brazil and India specifically. So
Yeah. I thought Apple was introducing something where maybe there was an option you could click in App Store Connect. There would be pricing that it could hopefully make a bit more sense. But it is tricky with some of the features being server-based, where say it costs me $1 a month to check your notifications. It's you're in India or the US, those server costs are the same to me. So it's tricky. But thankfully, I got Apollo to a point where the server costs were at a good point, and there was other things that didn't necessarily have those. The app icons had a monthly price to keep paying designers, but I kind of built that in a bit easier.
Okay, we're coming to a close very soon. So I just want to wrap up, but tell us, after 9+ years working on that app, right? How hard was it to just say, okay, I'm done with this? What have you been doing recently? Yeah.
It was hard, but it was also the last month was a battle. So it was by the end of it, I was so tired. It was kind of nice to take a break. If it just suddenly got Apple deleted it one day, they never would. But if that happened, I think that would have been a little bit harder, because it would have been so abrupt. The Reddit stuff was very abrupt, but at least I had that short 30 days to hash it out and talk it over with everybody. Like I said, I was at WWDC when it was all happening. So I had a lot of really smart people I could talk to and give me advice. In the way it went down was, I didn't want it to, but as far as it did go down in terms of the people around me and the advice I got, it helped me come to terms with it, I think, better than other situations might have allowed for. So I think like it shut down June 30th. And like by July 1st, Tears of the Kingdom, the Zelda game, came out. And I was like, I'm just going to play this for like 2 weeks. I'm not going to do anything. I just want to sleep. For a little while, I think I was content doing nothing because it was so exhausting dealing with all of that. But since then, I've been working more on PixelPals. With Apollo, I was going crazy all the time, building it like crazy. And in some ways, that took a lot out of me. And I'm approaching PixelPals a little more slowly and a little more balanced, I guess. It's maybe not growing as fast as Apollo was at certain points, but it's still growing really nicely. And I'm happy with the balance it has there. And it's a much lighter app to build. It's nice in some ways to just have a little bit of a different experience.
You don't depend on somebody else's API this time also.
Exactly. That's really nice too. It's like one of those things that like, yeah, now that I don't have to think about that, it's something that I didn't realize was wearing so heavy on me. And I loved building Apollo, but like, even if you love doing something, like doing it for 9 years and then getting a break from it, it's kind of fun in some ways. So I've kind of been enjoying doing something a little different.
Right. Just a quick aside, maybe a minute, not more than that. I remember PixelPals inside the Apollo app where you could like, Ilya, I don't know if you're familiar, but you could adopt a pet inside the Apollo app, right? Like a cat or like a cute dog and things like that. And the more you use the Apollo app, the pet gets to play and eat and all that. So it was like very well done. You decided to spin it out of that into an app of its own?
Yeah, because I think like I built all those features and people loved it. And it ended up getting tens of millions of views on TikTok or something. And there were a lot of people who were like, what the hell is Reddit? Like, I just want to feed a dog. Like, I don't get the connection. And I was like, okay, that kind of makes sense. They didn't know why they had to download this big complex app just to get a dog. So I was like, for these people, I'll build a separate app and like make it just about the animals, just about the pets, give it some more features, and then they can download that and it'll kind of make more sense. Because telling people, if you want PixelPals, download Apollo. Like they're like, wouldn't I download PixelPals? It didn't make a lot of sense for a lot of people. So spinning it off into this separate app allowed it to live a life of its own and kind of become its own app. And thankfully, like I just did that on a whim and it was one of the best decisions I made because after Apollo shut down, I now have this like secondary app that has a ton of users now.
Have you thought about like, what else do I want to work on?
Not a ton, honestly. I'm having a lot of fun with PixelPals just because it is so different and it's cute and fun and artsy. It's just so different that I'm having a lot of fun with that and it's doing so well. It's a lot of fun. There's other ideas I have, but I'm kind of just like, there's so many things I could do that it's almost paralyzing. I'm kind of just enjoying taking a little slow for a little bit and figuring out what I want to do.
That's totally well deserved too. So makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. Whenever I open like an iPad, an old iPad or something that still has Apollo on the home screen, the part of me is like, I just want to build a massive, super focused app that does really cool things. But at the same time, I'm also enjoying a little bit of taking a step back from iOS development and just going a little bit slower, even though I love it so much.
Okay, so just coming to the end, what advice do you have for app developers? Maybe people like us building our first app or more seasoned ones?
There's so many things you could say. Like, I feel like if you're beginning, try to choose a project that you yourself are passionate about as well, because you guys know building an app is like an enormous amount of effort. And I find it's literally hundreds of times easier if it's something you care about. If you're building an app to help people learn how to mow their lawn and you don't own a lawnmower, like you're just not going to care. Whereas if it's something that you're like, oh, sweet, I'm going to be able to figure out how to use my own lawnmower better. That is something you're passionate about. And even if nobody else uses it, you'll be able to use it and enjoy it. So I always try to tell people like, build something that you yourself will enjoy and you know a lot more about it in that way so you can approach it from a more unique perspective. But in terms of like having it out there, I find just like the best thing is just listening to users. So many people I find get in their own heads saying like, I know what users want more than they do. And to a certain extent, there is an aspect of that. Like you're building the app, you need to know what makes your app different than others. But from a certain point, just listening to users and knowing what their pain points are and what they wish the app would do differently really can help you form a roadmap as to like, you have this unique perspective into what makes your users happy. And you'd be really silly not to listen to it. So like always listening to like the emails and feedback you get and shaping that and using that to shape your app into something better, I think is one of the most important and big things you can do as an app developer.
All right. Yeah. Let's wrap it up. Any books, podcasts that you're listening to that you want to share with the world?
This one's really good. I definitely suggest people keep listening to this one.
Thank you.
I'm Christian Selig on pretty much every social media out there. But outside of that, no, I'm just enjoying stuff. Check out PixelPals, I guess.
Are you saying you're not like reading much or listening to podcasts?
No. It's all good. I listen to podcasts here and there, but nothing like consistent. No, I'm the worst person I'm the one weird person in the tech universe that's not super into that. And like most of the reading I do is just random like I got the new like XKCD What If book, and I'm reading through that.
That's one of our, I think, Ilya, you and I both have that, right? You have the second one too, I think.
So we have 3 books in our house, and my son loves them. Actually, I haven't even read the other one because he asked me to buy it, and I bought it for him. And he just devoured it in like 2 evenings.
Your son has excellent taste.
He's like into STEM, and he loved it. I mean, I loved it too. I got it for free at the conference. It was a Slack developer conference back in like 2016, I think, 2017. They were giving it away for free because Randall Munroe was doing the keynote. And I read the whole thing in the hotel in the evening and also on the flight next day because it was just so good.
I feel like the second book is even better. Like I enjoyed it even more, the second book.
That's fair. Yeah. No, I forget which one I have, but I'll have to pick up the other one too then.
Yeah. It's a what if and how to. I forgot which one I like more.
Okay. I'll read both and then get back to you.
Yeah, cool. Well, I'll be fully transparent. I'm not a big Reddit user.
Me neither anymore.
No, I am. Or I was, yeah.
I mean, I've tried it multiple times. It just doesn't stick. Yeah.
That's fair. There's so many social networks out there that there's always going to be something for someone.
Yeah. And that's why I was keeping quiet in the last like 20 minutes because I wasn't following all of that as much. But I really enjoyed talking to you about the app development and all that. That resonates a lot because like I'm seeing similarities on the meta level. Like, oh, we could apply this, we could apply that. And there's other people doing stuff could also apply that. So yeah, thanks a lot for saying yes and coming to our podcast.
This was a lot of fun. I'm really glad you guys invited me.
Yeah, it was awesome to have you. Thank you.
No, pleasure's mine. Thank you guys so much.
Yeah, and for those who are listening, we are about to ship our app. It's probably about another 3 to 4 weeks, but we will ship our beta. It's currently still in this kind of alpha stage where we have lots of bugs, but you can sign up for the waitlist at metacast.app.